Now, we're going to look at the four main reasons why animals need energy to survive. So, I'm going to give you a couple seconds. You can turn and talk to somebody sitting next to you. If you have paper and pencil nearby, you can jot them down. You could just think them in your mind if you'd like, but try to think of those four main reasons why the animals need energy. So, I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that. Okay, about 5 more seconds. All right. One of the first reasons that animals need energy is for growth. Okay, I'll put this up here. Once we go over our four reasons, we're going to explain what they all mean. The next reason, warmth. The next reason, movement. And the last reason, body repair. So now let's go over what all of these mean. First of all, growth. What does that mean, growth for an animal? Well, same thing it means for a human, really, is that the animal needs to grow to be able to survive. They have to develop into the adult animal. They can't stay a small animal. They have to develop and get the skills that they need as an adult to survive. They need to learn specific skills. What kind of skills would an animal need? Something like hunting for food, staying safe, survival, all things that an animal would need to know. Okay, let's talk about warmth. Why is that important for an animal? Why is warmth important? Well, warmth is important because animals need to regulate their body temperature, meaning they have to keep it at an even temperature, just like humans. Now, if you think about it, our body temperature is usually an even 98.6 degrees. That's right around where we are. If you're not feeling well and you get sick, usually you get a fever. Your body tries to combat that fever to regulate your body temperature to help you stay well. Animals have just about the same thing. They need to regulate that body temperature so that they can survive in their environment. Think about all the different environments that animals live in. We have animals that live in the North Pole, like polar bears. We have animals that live in other climates, like the desert. And they all have different ways to regulate that body temperature so that they can survive. Okay, let's talk about the next one, number 3, movement. Why do animals need movement? That seems like an easy one. Something to think about. Why do they need movement? Well, they need movement because they need to hunt for prey, and they need to hide from prey if they're being targeted, right? So they need to be able to hunt for their prey so that they can eat to survive, or hunt for food if they only eat plants and they don't eat other animals. But they also need to know how to hide and how to survive, how to move around. Okay, the last one, number 4, body repair. All right, think about body repair. What happens if you're outside and you're riding your bike and you fall? What happens? Well, if you didn't have on knee pads or anything protecting your skin, you would probably get like a little cut or a scrape on your arm. Well, your body needs to repair that cut or scrape. So what it's going to do is it's going to start to make that hard kind of scab that we get on the top. Same thing happens for animals, right? If they're injured, they need to heal those wounds. They need to get their body repaired so that they can resume normal activities. Okay? These are the 4 main reasons that the animals need the energy. So all of these ways are ways that they need that energy to survive. The first one was growth. The second one was warmth. Number 3 was movement. And number 4, body repair. Now, were you able to think of any of these on your own? Try and brainstorm other ways that they might be able to use these 4 ways to survive, besides the ones that we discussed. Okay? Now, what we're going to talk about now is how animals get the energy. So we discussed why they need the energy. Now we're going to think about how they get that energy. Okay, so we're going to talk about food chains. Now, you may or may not have learned about food chains in school, so you might have some background knowledge on this already. So let's talk about food chains together. Okay, what is a food chain? Okay, a food chain is a way to show the transfer of energy between animals. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to do something that I like to do in my class with my students. I'm going to show you an example of a food chain. Then I'm going to give you some animals and have you try to do it at home. So if you have paper and pencil, you can gather it. This way you can do that next. So I'm going to do a sample one for you. Grab my marker. Okay. So we're going to start with what all food chains are going to start with, where all of the energy starts with, what we discussed before, the sun. Now, the sun is going to give energy to, in this example, it gives energy to the grass. Okay? That grass is going to give energy to, in this example, a grasshopper. I'm going to put it down here. And the grasshopper is going to give energy to a frog. The frog will give energy to a snake. And the snake will give energy to a hawk. Now, the way I set up this food chain is important. You notice what they usually all start with, the sun, okay? Now, the way your arrow points is the way the energy is being transferred. So the sun gives the energy to the grass. So the arrow has to be pointing in the direction that it's going, the way the energy is flowing through the food chain. The arrows wouldn't be facing the opposite direction, even though that's the way they eat. For example, the hawk would eat the snake eats the frog eats the grasshopper eats the grass, and the grass gets energy from the sun. Okay? The arrows wouldn't point that way. That would actually be in the opposite direction. They need to point in the way that the energy is going to flow through that food chain. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to give you some examples. So if you have that paper and pen or pencil, crayon, whatever it is you have, I'm going to give you an example. And I want you to try and put that food chain in order in the example that I'm giving you, okay? So this is in no order. Use a marker. Okay, so the first one I want you to try, you're going to write down, is a nut tree. Next, a fox. Next, a squirrel. And the last one, the sun. Okay, so just really quickly, I'll hold them up for you one more time if you didn't get them all. We have a nut tree, fox, squirrel, and the sun. And what you're going to do is I want you to set it up like this and show me which way the arrows are facing so that you can see the transfer of energy from one thing to the next. I'm going to give you a couple seconds to set that up. I'm going to get my tape ready, and we're going to put your example right here on the bottom. So go ahead and take your time. All right. So what do all of the food chains start with? It should start with the sun. The sun should have been the first one that we put down. Okay, the sun. Now remember, your arrow points away from the sun because the sun gives energy to, what did you put next? The nut tree. Excellent. Remember your arrow. Now the nut tree is going to give energy to the squirrel, right? Okay, don't forget your arrow. And just because I'm entering this is going to go on the next line, but the last one you should have is fox. And the fox would be the last one in this food chain. And I'll just draw a little arrow down here too. Make sure you can see that. Gives energy to the fox. Okay, so here is our food chain completely set up. We have the sun, gives energy to the nut tree, which gives energy to the squirrel, which gives energy to the fox. Okay, so we have our two basic food chains. I want you to think about different animals that are in your neighborhood. What are some animals around your neighborhood? What could be those possible food chains? I'm going to give you a couple seconds just to think about that because there are food chains out there in our environment. Go ahead and think about that for a second. Okay, another thing we're going to discuss are food webs. Okay, now in order to really understand food webs, we have to do a food chain together to see that transfer of energy. A couple of vocabulary words we should know before we go into our food web. The first one is producer. Say that word, producer. Very good. A producer is anything that's going to make its own energy. For example, what did we discuss at the beginning of our lesson? The plant. Very good. So this nut tree here, or the grass in this food chain, would be our producer. Anything that eats plants is going to be called a consumer. Anything that eats plants or animals, I really should say, is called a consumer. So for example, in this food chain right here, what would be the consumers? Is the sun a consumer? No. Would the grass be a consumer? No. The grass is a producer. It makes its own energy. The grasshopper? Yes, it is a consumer. The frog? Yes, it is a consumer. The snake? Yes, a consumer. The hawk? Yes, a consumer. So down here on the one that we made together, we have the nut tree as the producer, our squirrel would be the consumer, and the fox would also be a consumer. Now, in the food chain that we made together, there is a difference in the consumers between the squirrel and the fox. The squirrel is actually called a primary consumer. Okay, what does the word primary mean? Tying in some vocab for you. What does the word primary mean? Primary means first. So the squirrel is actually our first consumer, meaning it's the first animal to start consuming that food. So the squirrel would be our primary consumer, which makes the fox, it wouldn't be primary, it would be secondary, meaning it comes next. So it would be our secondary consumer. Okay. Let's go over some of the vocabulary that we discussed in the last 15 minutes because it was a lot of different words that I just gave you. First of all, we went over food chains, which show the transfer of energy from one thing to another. In the food chain that I gave you, we had the sun giving energy to the grass, which gave energy to the grasshopper, which gave energy to the frog, which gave energy to the snake, and the snake gave energy to the hawk. So you can see that kind of transfer of energy. We noted how important those arrows are. The arrows have to show the direction that the energy is going. So the sun should be pointing towards that grass. We also talked about producers and consumers. A producer is something that's going to make its own energy. So for example, in the one we did down here, the nut tree would be the producer. It makes its own energy with the help of the sun. In the larger food chain we had, this grass is going to get its energy from the sun. It makes its own, which makes it a producer, right? The other word we discussed is consumer, right? Those would be your animals or living things that eat other living things to survive. This squirrel eats the nut tree. This fox eats the squirrel, okay? A couple other words that are important to know. Okay, is we have herbivore, okay? A herbivore would be a specific type of animal that eats only plants to survive. So a herbivore eats only plants to survive. So this squirrel only eats plants. It is not going to eat other animals to survive. Another type of animal or living thing would be a carnivore. Okay? A carnivore eats only animals to survive. So it does not eat plants, it only eats meat. So if we were going to look at this snake would only eat the other living thing. So it would only eat that frog. That would make it a carnivore. It would not eat plants, okay? Same thing with a hawk, right? The hawk is going to eat that snake or other tiny little birds, which would mean it would only eat meat, which makes it a carnivore. Okay, so those are just the different types of living things that you're going to see out there in our environment. Okay, so we'll say the words one more time. I'm going to say the words. If you could repeat the words, that would be great. So we have just a lot of vocab here. Food chain, producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, herbivore, and carnivore. Now, if you wanted to take a minute and kind of write down these words, this way you can remember them. Sometimes if you write down words, say on index cards with a marker, pencil, crayon, whatever it is that you have, if you don't have index cards, you could always just use paper. It makes it a little bit easier to remember. So you can definitely come up with different food chains that live in your neighborhood, in your area, in your environment. Take a second, just go over this, make sure that you understand it. The next thing we're going to do together is we're going to talk about what happens when different food chains intertwine with one another. So many food chains make up something really big called a food web. For our next activity we're going to do together, you definitely need paper and pencil. If you have a colored pencil, crayon, marker, whatever it is you'd like to use. If you have index cards, that works. If not, you could use regular paper. I'm going to be using regular paper with you. So if you wanted to gather those materials together before we started, that would be great. So I'll give you about a minute to gather your materials.